Hey, this is Charlie Thompson, and welcome to the lecture slide video for ethnic geography. What are we going to talk about in this chapter? We'll talk about everything that came before. No, not really. It's just a good chapter because we're talking about ethnicity and a lot of the topics that we covered before, like population and migration. We talked about why people move. Now we're going to see where they end up and what kind of patterns migrating people create in cities and the landscape. So it's kind of nice in that a lot of the ideas that we've talked about before are all going to be explained and used in this chapter again. So yeah, they left someplace, that discussion of push and pull factors, they left someplace for a reason, and they're going to go to someplace else, which is going to create patterns on the landscape. Yeah. So race. One of the things we'll talk about in this chapter is race. And we'll talk about what the difference is between race. Well, race doesn't really exist. Ethnicity exists. Nationality definitely exists. We'll talk about ethnic regions. We'll talk about environmental racism. We'll talk about ethnicity and the economy. And we'll talk about ethnic landscapes, both real and fake. So an ethnic group or an ethnicity, this is just a Wikipedia definition, it's a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups, such as a common set of traditions, ancestry, language, history, society, culture, nation, religion, or social treatment within their residing area. So I think this kind of goes back to the idea of a nation. And I really appreciated the comment. Somebody commented last week talking about sports teams as an analogy for a nation, that they may not actually have physical territory, but they could still be a nation. So it's kind of the same deal with an ethnic group. So there's some sort of a common set of shared characteristics, like it could be language, cultural traditions. So now we're going back to the chapter on folk culture and pop culture, language, the chapter on language, society, culture, nationality, religion. So all this stuff is stuff that we've talked about before. It's just all kind of coming together now in these last two chapters of ethnic geography. And then the next 2 weeks we'll spend on urban cities. Ethnicity versus race versus nationality. So we just saw a pretty good definition of ethnicity. I'm really pretty happy with ethnicity. We'll look at the distribution of ethnicities, where different groups are found in the United States. We'll talk about ethnic landscapes. We'll talk about African-American migration. We'll talk about segregation. So race really doesn't exist. Graves says early on that some people say the idea of race was just something that people made up to make slavery easier, which just seems totally believable. Yeah, looking into, if you go cruising through the Wikipedia article on slavery, specifically Native American slavery, that a fair chunk of the population of many West Coast tribes was made up of slaves. And those slaves were often former prisoners of war who were then used as slaves. And if they had children, their children were also slaves. So I think a key aspect of that is creating an other. You have to make other people somehow different enough from you that it's okay to do that. And we see this with propaganda leading up to wars. For example, I just saw about the first Gulf War, the lead up of the first Gulf War. There was some very impassioned testimony from a young woman who testified that she had seen Iraqi soldiers taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators. That was one of the reasons given for the first invasion of Iraq. It never happened. It was all made up. But it sure made it easier to invade Iraq if they're killing babies. They're baby killers. We have to do something. Well, It turns out she was the daughter of the ambassador. The story was made up. It was all an elaborate hoax. So this is all just an example of it's easy to treat people as less than human if you consider them to be less than human because they're different than you. Well, their skin's a different color, their hair is different, their eye color is different, they speak a different language, they have a different religion, they don't have a religion, whatever those reasons are that humans create to separate people. So race is one of those very powerful ideas that makes it really easy to discriminate, to be prejudiced against a group of other people. And in fact, everything biology tells us is race. There's just humans. There's no such thing as races. There's obvious differences in skin color, but the idea of race just doesn't exist. So ethnicity, we just talked about that, shared common attributes. And then nationality, I think the easiest definition for me for nationality is what your passport says. So like I've got an American passport, so my nationality is American. Yeah, we're pretty much done with race. Race doesn't exist. It's a made-up idea. And as an example of how made up this idea, three different things that we've tried to use in the United States to classify people by race. And I think you'll immediately see how bullshit these ideas are. Skin tone. Right. Well, there you go. So we'll just arbitrarily decide if your skin tone is this, that you're black, and if your skin tone is this, you're white. Hair, the texture of hair has been used as a tool to identify different races, the different types of African hair, for example, and then eye shape. Yeah, it just kills me. Yeah, we'll just look at you, and if you look a little different, we're going to say that you're in this race, which is completely made up and ridiculous. But we can use it to persecute you or be prejudiced against you. But we've got good reasons, although we're the ones who made up those reasons, and they're not good reasons. They're, in fact, bad reasons. I think I'm done with race. Yeah, eye shape, whatever. So one of the problems... Yeah, one of the problems is if you're thinking about these things, African Americans carry about 20% European genes. The average African American, about 20% of their genes are identifiable as European genes. About 10% of African Americans carry more than 50% European genes. However, in this country, they would be considered black. There's some good stuff about differences, different cultural conceptions that we'll talk about in a bit, but this is just the ridiculousness of skin tone. And then these 20% African Americans carry about 20% European genes. So what we're forced to confront then is the legacy of rape, that African Americans carrying those 20% European genes, those 20% European genes and their last names are all probably from their slave owners. That's the most common way that all of that happened. And it's just, it's tragic, and I don't think it gets talked about a lot. So physical geography of race, there are some physical factors that we can look at. Skin tone, for example, is one aspect. Lactose tolerant. So these are obvious physical differences that lie on a spectrum. They're not binary. There's nothing you could use to go, well, this magic number means that you're in this race. It still doesn't work that way. In fact, skin tone just tells you where your ancestors have been for a long amount of time. Skin color, hair characteristics, eye shape, language, religion, national heritage. Yeah, none of these are really good for identifying people by race. Lactose intolerance. Regions of the world with greater lactose intolerance. South America, Africa, Asia, especially high rates of lactose intolerance. Very low rates of lactose intolerance in Western Europe. In fact, Northwestern Europe. So we're talking about Scandinavia and Denmark, England, United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland. And then Australia would just mainly be imported British people. So yeah, lactose intolerance. Old world lactose intolerance or tolerance. This is lactose tolerance. And it's kind of an interesting, I found this diagram and then I looked at it and I thought, oh, I see what's going on. That's really interesting. So the dots represent the actual locations that they took samples. I'm assuming that they went out and collected blood from people, something like that. So each of these dots represents like a city. It's probably Timbuktu or Ouagadougou. And then in between, they're interpolating. So like these different colors are just based on the difference between this dot and this dot over space. So it's kind of interesting that, like, you know, these two dots set the color for most of this region, right? In fact, across Australia, we've got like one dot, same thing with New Zealand. So they're just going to tell us everybody in New Zealand, this is their approximate lactose tolerance based on one city. But the general trend, I think, is still applicable. It matches with other maps I've seen of lactose tolerance and intolerance. So if you're from this region of the world, chances are you're really good at digesting lactose. So this is showing ultraviolet light received at the surface, local solar noon over the full year, with the reds and the pinks being high levels of ultraviolet light here at high elevations, high altitudes in the tropics. Slightly higher elevations, but you can see there's an overall trend from high ultraviolet light to low ultraviolet light. And your skin tone, well, it changes in response to damage, but your base level skin tone is just a function of how much ultraviolet light your ancestors received. If your ancestors were in the tropics, they were getting lots of ultraviolet light, which is so powerful that it breaks apart the chemical bonds in your DNA, damages your skin, damages your DNA. On the other hand, if you live north of 39 degrees, I think this is a U.S. Department of Agriculture advisory. If you're African American and you live north of 39 degrees, you're not getting enough ultraviolet light for your body to synthesize vitamin D. And so the USDA advises African Americans living north of 39 degrees to take supplemental vitamin D. In fact, this is going back to chapter 1 with the importance of latitude. It's just another example of the ridiculousness of racism. So if your genes were hanging out in the tropics, your skin probably has lots of melanin to protect it from being damaged by the sun. And if you live at a higher latitude, your skin probably has much less melanin because that would actually prevent you from being able to manufacture vitamin D. The fun stuff happens when people, for example, from this region where they're getting very little ultraviolet light are shipped as criminals to Australia, which gets lots and lots and lots of ultraviolet light. So, you know, it'd be fun to come back in 100,000 years and see what's happened to skin tones across Australia. I would be willing to bet that the future generations of Australians, really like 100,000 years in the future, will have different skin tone than their Irish and British ancestors did. So that ultraviolet light then plays out in skin tone. I think it's really interesting that the higher values are right here in the subtropics, not over the equator where you'd expect, but that also follows the pattern of solar energy, with the highest amounts of solar energy over the course of a year coming in at the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. So we've got skin tone as a function of latitude because of ultraviolet light. So yeah, if you want to try to pretend that there's something called race, what you're really going to end up is mapping out the latitude of their ancestral DNA. That's what skin color looks like, to a scientist anyway. So ethnicities across Africa. I spent 2 days last week. I just got so excited when I found these maps. This would be a region with very high diversity, with these different ethno-linguistic. So it's a combination of ethnicity and language. And then I just went nuts and made a bunch of maps. So this is the green polygons are ethnic regions, or tribal regions. So this would be the area occupied by one ethnicity. And here's another ethnicity. And for years, I've noticed two things. Number one, that as you get closer to the equator, the size of the territories gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And as you get under the subtropical high, where the Sahara Desert is, or the Namib Desert, or the Kalahari Desert, the ranges are much larger. So what we're seeing is early agriculture, well, early, I mean, Murdoch did his research in 1959. But I think what we're seeing is the difference in the size based on whether they're hunters and gatherers or agriculturists. And so digging into Murdoch's data, I found that there was actual, so if they've got a green, if they have territory on this map showing just the distribution of ethnic territories, and they don't exist on this map, that means that there was no data. Murdoch just didn't collect data on. The orange places are sedentary, so they're probably doing agriculture. The brown places are semi-nomadic, and the red regions are the areas occupied by people who are fully nomadic. So there is no house, there is no land. They have a territory that they migrate through over the course of a year. And indeed, looking at Google Earth with the base imagery underneath, Google Maps, the Google satellite data, you can see there's a really clear association between the places where people are doing agriculture, they're green, which means that they get enough rain to be green, and the places where people are fully nomadic are brown, much more desert. And then I did two more maps. So in this case, the ethnicities are in this magenta color and rainfall in the background. So there's a clear relationship between the size of the ethnic territory and the amount of rainfall they're getting. And this is carbon fixed by plants per year. So kilograms of carbon per square meter of land. And again, that relationship between low net primary productivity and large areas, high productivity and small ethnic areas, I just found totally fascinating. All right, skin color, yeah. So skin color is also has social construction, right? I mean, there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about any particular skin color, but in the United States and in Europe, and all over the world, there's been a couple trends throughout human history. So if the poor people are tan, then it's good to be pale. So looking at people in, tan is good if the poors have to work inside. So during the Renaissance, the farmers, the peasants, stupid peasants, the peasants are going to be tan because they're working outside in the fields, and the aristocrats, the members of the monarchy are going to be in their castle. They're going to be all nice and pale. So the wealthier you are, the less time you spend outside, the more tan you are, the poorer you are. Well, this is flip-flopped as the result of the shift from an agricultural economy to a service economy. So now, aside from construction workers and people who work outside, the poors have to work inside in an office building and don't have time to tan. So now we're back to, it's good to be tan. That being tan is a sign of wealth and privilege. Witness Mitt Romney, witness Donald Trump and their fake tans as a sign of health and vibrancy and prestige. So if you've been colonized by Europeans, pale is good. White is good. Dark skin is no longer good. And I've been aware of skin lightening creams. Many of them contain incredibly toxic chemicals. I mean, we're already dealing with toxic racism. If you've been told that your skin color, your natural skin color is objectionable, you need to change it because there's something wrong with the color of your skin. Here, put this cream. It's got mercury in it. It's going to kill you maybe, or at least poison you, but your skin will be lighter. So in the Middle Ages, the aristocrats used lead powder to make their skin look whiter, so they were killing themselves. Now they use tanning beds, which cause skin damage just like exposure to the sun. There's nothing safe about a tanning bed. Oh my God, there's this, and I put a link to the project. So somebody did a project where they took a picture of this young woman and they sent it to 18 different countries and said, hey, can you retouch this photo so that so that they look good according to you. So here we've got the starting image, and the US looks like they did some, minor editing, although she's certainly much thinner. And if you click through the link, they did a weight and body mass index analysis of the people to see which cultures were all, oh, no, the thinner you are, the better you are. For example, Italy, Egypt. Yeah, I liked Egypt. And it's just interesting seeing what different people do. Like Italy's all, well, she can't have red underwear. Or she can't have white underwear. It's got to be red. And Egypt's all, well, her hair, clearly, that's where we're going to start with. Look at that. It's all brown. Why isn't it black? This is skin lightening ads, chemicals to put on your skin from Africa. I know that Africa is a continent and not a country. Another skin lightening cream from Africa. India, very associated with a caste system. Here we've got new Fair and Lovely. So if you use this, you're lovely. So if you don't use it, I guess you're ugly. Japan, Tokyo White, see the white, feel the white, live the white. I mean, it really doesn't get any more obvious than that. They're saying the quiet parts out loud. So we've got Japan, China, and the most shocking of all, this ad in Thailand for skin lightening products. And in the United States, this is like 1950, 1960, different skin tone cream. Lighter, lovelier skin beauty for you. So African Americans in this country, still to this day, there is dark skin is lower status than lighter African American skin. Even within the African American community, they've internalized that external colonist racism. And yeah, in the book, in Graves' text, he talks about these people from East Jackson, Ohio. There's a radio program on them. They were a product of the one drop rule, which said if you have even one drop of African American blood, you're black. Yeah, just absolutely crazy. So there's some links to this family. There's an extended family, and it's just a good example of the ridiculousness of racism. I mean, yeah, nobody needs to put a label on these people. But the government decided back in the day that they're going to decide what race people are, so you got to shoehorn them into those categories even if they don't fit. And this, Cumberland Posey. So this is Cumberland Posey in here with his cousins. And in Graves' text, he mentions that when the cousins moved out of town, they started identifying as white. In this town, they identified as African American, and it really reminded me of the discussion of the caste system in India. That one of the ways the caste system is breaking down today is just physical mobility. Like you're born into your caste. I mean, it's just like being African American. If your parents are African American and you're the product of your parents, you're going to be African American. And especially in a small town where everybody knows your parents and your parents' parents, everybody knows everybody's business, you can't just decide one day to say, oh no, I'm white. But if you move to another town and nobody knows you and you can pass for white, you become white. So we've got Cumberland Posey, who was a baseball and basketball player and owner later on. I think he was a co-owner of a basketball team, but it's just interesting. It's interesting. It's tragic and stupid, the legacy of racism in the United States. Place makes race. If there wasn't the friction of distance, races and ethnicities wouldn't develop. If everybody could, if all of human history, if humans had been able to travel any place without the friction of distance, there would be no reason not to go far, and everybody would have mixed together at this point. So if that wasn't for the friction of distance, races and ethnicities wouldn't develop. Without spatially enforced separation, erosion of ethnicity and racial identity occurs. This is also true. If you say, For example, in the United States, up until the Loving decision, which put an end to laws in this country against interracial marriage. That used to, yeah. So yeah, I realize that there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but gosh, it really seems like the arc of humanity is tending towards better and better and better and better. So now we're looking at other things. Back in the 50s and the 60s, it was illegal for black people and white people to be married in some states. And so without those enforced separation, you're going to get the gradual erosion of ethnicity and racial identity, where things are going to mix together, the lines are going to become blurred. I mean, everybody will still have their heritage, but that heritage is going to become increasingly mixed. Yeah, who's white or black or whatever group, like in apartheid South Africa, under their racist system, they had whites, blacks, and coloreds. And they're all social constructs. And by a social construct, I mean humans just made this stuff up. There's obviously people have different skin tones, but the idea that you could separate everybody into neat categories of white and black and colored, it's just ridiculous. South Africa, the pencil test. If they put a pencil in your hair and it stuck, you were black. If your hair wasn't curly enough and it would fall out, congratulations, you're white. Brazil, with the mixed population of indigenous people, and so Brazil is a mix of indigenous people, Native Americans, Native South Americans, and then the Portuguese, Europeans, and imported African slaves. And so Brazil looks at race and ethnicity differently than the United States, differently than South Africa, differently than Europe. Like in this country, Spanish people, like the fuzziness around people from Spain. Are they white? Are they not white? It depends on where you are. In this country, you could be of Spanish descent and get lumped in with people from Mexico in those racist policies. But if you're in Europe, I mean, Spain, ethnically, the social construction of ethnicity in Spain would be they're white. They're like, people from France. We don't look at people from France and say, oh, they're a separate race. We don't look at, oh God. And when I say we, I mean people of white European ancestry. I'm just going to speak for myself. I don't look at people from Germany and France and say, well, they're clearly a different race than the people from Spain, because I recognize that race is a made up, stupid concept. But it's interesting to see how different countries interpret these different ideas. Yeah, Spain. Language, one of the other ways to divide people up, stupid. In this country, only people that speak Spanish get put in their own race. I'm just laughing at the idea of putting people at Pig Latin, French. I mean, when you're filling out the census form, they'll say, oh, if you're French, then you're French. Your race is French. No, but if you speak Spanish, you could get lumped into the Hispanic group. Yeah, the U.S. classifies everybody into the Hispanic and not Hispanic. There, that's convenient. Looking at languages in Switzerland, we've got French over here in the green. We've got German over here in the orange. We've got one purple, Italian, and then we've got Romansh and some bilingual areas. Religion has been used as a way of establishing a race. Primarily Jews and Muslims are the targets of this, although Judaism is a religion. It's not an ethnicity. It is an ethnic religion, but it's not like everybody who's Jewish came from one village, right? It's and same thing with Islam. With people that are Muslim, one of the interesting things I thought in one of the documentaries on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that you're supposed to make if you're Muslim once in your life, was that they had them geographically segregated. So like all the Muslims from Ethiopia would be in one place, and all the Muslims from one part of Indonesia would be in another place, so that you're with people who I think they look at it as making everybody more comfortable. Everybody is going to speak the same language, have more similar food preferences than, you know, an American Muslim from Southern California compared with a Muslim from Albania, compared with a Muslim from the Uyghur provinces in China. Yeah, it's just, I think you can see the ridiculousness of trying to use religion as a way of establishing race. Oh, yeah. So I was looking for this. I think I made mention to it in the video on politics. This is Marshal Tito. He was the dictator who ruled Yugoslavia. And here's a great quote. "I am the leader of one country which has 2 alphabets, 3 languages, 4 religions, 5 nationalities, 6 republics, surrounded by 7 neighbors. A country in which live 8 ethnic minorities." So looking at language, religion, ethnicity. So we've got the breakup of Yugoslavia into Slovenia up here, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Macedonia. And then some of the complexity, the Balkans in 1914 with the Ottoman Empire down here, Bosnia and Serbia, and half of Romania, including the part where they speak Magyar, which is spoken in Hungary. So what are we looking at now? This is nationalities. These are just the borders of countries. We're just looking at nationalities. Now we're looking at ethnicities. So we've got Slovenes, we've got Croats, we've got Serbs, we've got Muslims, we've got Macedonians, we've got Albanians. So this is a great example that the people who lived in Kosovo are the Kosovar Albanians, that ethnically they're Albanian. So their nationality would be Kosovo. They're from Kosovo. But their language and their religion and their culture, it's all Albanian. So ethnically, they're Albanian. Nationally, they're Kosovar Albanians, or they're from Kosovo, rather. And one of the things, unfortunately, you got to talk about with ethnicity is the idea of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is when you don't want to kill them all, you just want them gone. So this in former Yugoslavia took the form of Serbian, and yeah, I think this is all review. I don't need to go into a lot, but the driving out of Bosnian Muslims, predominantly by Greek Orthodox Serbs, was what happened there. And ethnic cleansing is different than genocide. Genocide, I want them all killed. I don't want any of these people left on the planet. Ethnic cleansing is, I don't care if they're alive or dead. I just don't want them in my neighborhood. And so I'm going to drive them out. Genocide would be like what Hitler did. His idea was that he didn't want any Jews left. Good and bad of ethnicity. It's not all racism and prejudice. Ethnicity, one of the things about ethnicity is it keeps alive cultural traditions and maintains group cohesion. You know, if you... Yeah, back in the day when we used to go out and congregate in public, there would be things in, coming up this weekend, there's a Pacific and Asian Island or an Asian and Pacific Islander festival in downtown Sac. There's a Greek Heritage Day. There's a Romanian festival. It's the Hmong New Year. It's the Persian New Year. It's a Sikh festival. So the good of ethnicity is keeping alive positive cultural traditions and maintaining group cohesion through these shared rituals and celebrations. Family, kinship, courtship, friendship, all of that, recreation, political power as part of ethnicity. It's going to be interesting in this country as the United States tries to deal with the Armenian genocide by the Turks right around World War I. Relatively controversial. The United States has a hard time saying, yeah, the Turks tried to kill the Armenians. Yeah, the downside would be suspicion, distrust, clannishness, and violence. That's the downside of ethnicity. According to Lecture, Scientific evidence now suggests which of the following is not a valid method of grouping people. The answer, of course, is race. Race is just a made-up idea. It's not a valid way. Ethnicity? Sure. Nationality? Sure. Religion? Maybe. Race? No, it doesn't exist. It's a made-up idea. Often for ethnicities, there's a pressure to merge to become, especially in this country, as opposed to Canada, which is totally fascinating. In Canada, and I'll talk about this later, they kind of just said, yeah, you can be a Canadian, whatever. We don't care. Keep your traditions. That's fine. You've got your own language. Great. Keep speaking it. In this country, though, there is tremendous pressure from racists for people with distinctive traditions to assimilate and become American. You know, the gajillion stories about people being accosted in public for speaking their language by somebody who demands that they speak English. So that's acculturation, the adoption of enough host culture to blend in economically and socially. Assimilation is when you've completely become whatever the dominant culture is. Marriage, the most effective assimilative tool. Groups may choose not to assimilate. Hasidic Jews would be a great example of this. Their dress, their language, their culture, all of it. Groups may not be permitted to assimilate. So, for example, the laws against interracial marriage isn't a thing. You can't have interracial marriage because race doesn't exist. But the laws on the books in the United States that didn't allow black and white people to get married, for example, would be an example of how you're not permitted to assimilate. So ethnic regions, it's how they exist across the landscape. Ethnic groups arrange themselves or are arranged in a variety of patterns on the landscape that can be mapped, so automatically geography because there's a spatial aspect to it. They may be large, covering many states as ethnic homelands. They could be small, could just be an ethnic neighborhood or a ghetto. So this is a screenshot from a dot map. One dot, one person. So literally they're representing everybody in the United States by ethnicity. We're going to see a bunch of dots. We're going to see a bunch of different maps that I found on the web to talk about patterns of ethnicity. But man, I just love this map for all kinds of different reasons. And here's a link to it. I really hope you go to the link and explore it. So the blue are white people. You can see the dominant color, at least in the northern parts of this country, are pretty much blue. You can see African Americans up the eastern seaboard, and you can still see the black belt soils from day one. Like I said, it's all coming back. You can see big cities: Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Atlanta, DC, New York, Philly, Chicago, Denver, LA, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle have obvious racial patterns on the land that we'll look at in a bit. Asian, red, Hispanic, brown, black is green, and multi-ethnic is this brownish color. Oh, and also I was going to say Native American. So like up in here, this is all Native American. In South Dakota and Montana, there's going to be pockets of isolated Native Americans. And then as you zoom in and zoom out, good things happen. Oh, right. Back to Chicago. So back to day one, when you're talking about regions, this would be a functional. No, it's not a functional region. It's a formal region because everything inside it is inside the city limits of Cicero. So we've got Cicero, we've got Berwyn, we've got Oak Park, 99% white, 99% African American, and then 80% white, 20% African American in Oak Park. And I wondered, so this is old data, what's it look like on the dot map? So I zoomed in and overlaid it on the dot map, and it looks pretty much exactly the same, except now instead of, except nothing. I don't know if anything's changed. This says 99% white. Depending on the census form at the year that this was done, and at the beginning of the chapter, Steve Graves has a couple examples of different census forms over the years that your choices for your race as reported on the census form, have really changed dramatically, which is good because it gives us a much more detailed idea of race and ethnicity in this country, but also bad because as the categories change, that means that you can't compare previous years to the current year because the data is stored in such a way to make that impossible. So we've got white, although I was going to say this is Hispanic, but like I said, race is a cultural construction. It's just something that people have made up. So Hispanics, it's entirely possible if they would have self-identified as white at this point, they would have looked at it and gone, well, I'm not Asian, I'm not black, I guess I'm white. But so here we've got Columbus Park, here we've got Chicago, and Chicago is very black. Oak Park is fairly white. And then Cicero and this other area are, looks like Hispanic with a smattering of African-American and then Asians. It's interesting, higher proportion of Asians in the white neighborhood, which I think, and a good map answers questions. An excellent map leaves you with questions like, okay, now what I want to see is income or some sort of socioeconomic status, income, wealth, home ownership, something. Like, are we looking at class or are we looking at race? Class would be how much money you have, and yeah, race would be race. So there's the dot map for Chicago. Here's California with a brown Central Valley, really red Asian Bay Area, Sacramento with blue foothills. Ah, yes, the I'm not wearing a mask and I'm not getting a vaccine because this is all a pandemic because I live in Placerville. And then Los Angeles with just enormous diversity. Oh, that's interesting. Palm Springs with rich white people, Indio, Hispanic, agricultural workers, I would assume. And then if you look at Sacramento, like I said, I really hope you spend some time and zoom in with heavily Asian areas, African-American areas, blue-white areas, Davis, hella red and blue, Woodland, blue and Hispanic, so white and Hispanic. What are we up? Yeah, blue, Roseville, Citrus Heights, blue. Oh, God. And then I saw this and I wondered, what is, oh, it's the prison. Yeah, if you want to see, if you want proof that our criminal justice system is racist AF, there you go. Why is the prison made up of black people given that they are a minority in this state? Huh. Where have Americans come from over time? The answer, kind of surprisingly to me, I just would have assumed that it would have been much more English. In fact, there's more Irish than English. That's amazing. And African Americans are the third largest ancestral group. So we got German, Irish, German, the majority, by 50%. 50% more Germans than Irish. American? Okay. Mexican, Italian, Polish, French, Scots, Dutch, Norwegian, Scots, Irish. This is showing, I think, the dominant minority group in each region. So pretty much across the U.S., white people are the majority. And so this is looking at what's the number 2 group. And yeah, no surprises here. Hey, look, it's the Black Belt again. So African Americans in the South and up the Eastern Seaboard. Hispanics, I would assume there'd be a chunk from the Cuban exiles, and Hispanics in the South and Southwest, and then Native Americans being the majority in the dominant minority in, for example, Arizona, up here in the Hopi and Navajo country, and then other Native American groups up here. So, largest ancestry, largest population, African American, white people, Germans, all the blue is German. This color, and we got French up here on the other side of Quebec. That's not surprising. What's the pink? Mexican, as opposed to Hispanic or Spanish. That's fun. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I love geography. I love maps. Look at that. Got this big chunk of Spanish people in New Mexico. Maybe it should be called New Spain. English people, English ancestry, Dutch. Huh. And no Pennsylvania Dutch, they're German. Pennsylvania Dutch, it's actually Pennsylvania Deutsch. But around World War I, there was anti-German sentiment in this country. Just like World War II, everybody hated the Japanese. Well, not everybody, but the Japanese were illegally discriminated against in this country. And so during World War I, a lot of German people just went with the misconception that they were Pennsylvania Dutch. Dutch, sure. Yeah, we're Dutch. So distribution of percent Hispanic or Latino. I don't think there's any surprises there. Puerto Rico. Look at that. Huh. African American. No real surprise there. Asian American. I was going to say kind of coastal, at least in terms of the West Coast. And then looking at these areas as cultural, looking in terms of human geography, looking at them in terms of cultural homelands, the idea that there would be more, a more homogenous culture across, like, yeah, concentrations of ethnic islands. That would be some sort of European stuff going on. Hispanic homeland, the Mormon cultural region, Nunavut cultural region, the French-Canadian cultural region, Pennsylvania Dutch, there they are again, although Pennsylvania German. I don't know why I have two of these. Well, hopefully one of them is easier to read for you. I hope you enjoy that. It's another map showing the same thing. Oh, yeah, I like this one because it breaks down Mexican, Cuban, and Spanish. So, yeah, Cubans down here. African Americans. Oh, that's interesting. The Germans across here, English across here. That last one showed Utah as being predominantly German. Or predominantly English, sorry. Let's just go back. Oh, that was a mistake. Yeah, English. Interesting. So what I was going to comment here is we're looking at Scandinavians. We saw this in the map on religion, looking at the distribution of Lutherans. So this is people from Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden as the result of, well, the climate's the same. It's just like home. That'll be perfect. Chicago, ethnicities in Chicago. There's Cicero and Berwyn. And African American in blue, Mexican in yellow, Polish in orange. That's some good fun. Irish in green, Mexican in yellow. Oh yeah, I thought this was fun. Looking at cartograms, so the size of the chunk indicates where you're from. This would be Chicago, 1910. Looks like Germany and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with Germany and Russia being the dominant. And in the 1990s, looks like Mexico, with a substantial Asian portion. So I would think that they'd be getting a lot of better restaurants and also some African areas. The Louisiana French homeland, 1939, doing geography by looking through phone books, looking for French last names. And now in 2000, we can see that those patterns are still preserved on the landscape, with the regions that have the most French last names being the regions where people are speaking French or Cajun French. Very nice. Very, very nice. Yeah, folk culture, survival regions, none of these exist anymore. There's no true folk culture in North America, so you can forget about all those dog trot, salt box, shotgun shack, all those folk housing ideas. Oh man, yeah. All kinds of questions. Like, what are the Ukrainians doing up there in Canada? How'd they get there? Huh. ethnic islands are smaller, much smaller than a homeland. So yeah, like the African American cultural homeland, or yeah, upland southern homeland. Yeah. So ethnic islands smaller than a homeland. Could be just a county or a town. Often they're rural, all over the upper Midwest. So for example, Stromsburg, the Swede capital of Nebraska. And this is Solvang. Solvang's down by Santa Barbara in California, and they are a Danish tourist town. However, I was going to say I did some research. I looked it up on Wikipedia. That was my research. But Solvang is legit. So in the book, Graves talks smack about, well, yeah, they've got these windmills because Americans are stupid and didn't realize that the windmills are associated not necessarily with the Dutch, but with, where? But he's wrong. Solvang was actually founded by a group of Danish immigrants. So Solvang was founded by people from Denmark who wanted to make it look kind of like Denmark. So I'm going to go Solvang today. Sure, it's a tourist trap, but it was founded as a legit Danish, what's the word we're looking for? A Danish ethnic island. Yeah. Ethnic substrate. I suppose I should talk about it. It's the idea that there's these broad regions of culture across the United States that we were just looking at again and again and again. So like these cultural regions, these cultural regions, these cultural regions. So across this whole, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 state and province region, there would be the dominant baseline culture would be this German immigrant culture. So the substrate is the surface below the surface. What's below the surface? The foundation. Although it's not as stable and important as a foundation, but maybe foundation is a good way of thinking of it. So let's get back to this ethnic substrate. So it's akin to an extinct ethnic homeland or a huge assimilated ethnic island. The German field of the upper Midwest is an example. Oh, good. Well, it matches the map, right? That's always good when what I have to say matches the maps that I'm showing you. I think that as a student, I would have more confidence if the professor was generally correct about what they were saying, as opposed to, it seems like they're just making up stuff because it seems to change all the time. That would not inspire confidence. Nobody seems too German, but there's a lot of beer and brats. So it's almost like an unconscious thing, right? It's just like a memory of what used to be there, trapped in the landscape. Why would such a place die out? Well, new people would come in. That could be one way it would die out. Enforced ethnic regions. So there's two things, two horrific aspects of enforced ethnic regions. The first was the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of Native Americans in this country from their homes, from their territories, where literally they'd been living there for 10 to 20,000 years. 10 to 20,000 years. And within a generation, within a decade, in many of these places, the majority of the people that they knew were murdered, and the survivors were rounded up and shipped across the country. I think that's a pretty good summary of the Native American experience in the United States. And a similar enforced ethnic region involves African Americans. And there's two things I wanted to comment on with regards to Native Americans and African Americans and how perverse American treatment of them seems to be to me at this point in time. So Native Americans, in the chapter on language, I gave examples of Chiricahua Apache folk stories and how important those stories were in Apache culture. That these were the stories about how to be a good member of that society, and they all happened right here, like our European folk tales, right? because America is largely a nation of America at this point is largely a nation of European immigrants. So a long time ago in a land far, far away, that'd be Europe, right? So for Native Americans, no. It was right there, like that little spot in Arcade Creek. And so for a people who lived off of the land, had been living in the same place for 10,000 years, they knew the plants, they knew the animals. And when I say no, I mean like you would know individual animals. You would know the plants and where they live and what the seeds look like and what they taste like at different times of the year and when's the best time to harvest them. And all of that was just shattered in a decade. As, like I said, the ones that weren't murdered by whites were rounded up and shipped across the country, no longer able to speak their language, forced to cut their hair, forced to go to white man's church. Their religion, their language, their hair, everything about them was ripped away by racist white people. And African Americans, so the Native Americans, I started thinking of the place-based aspect to their culture. And I was watching a documentary on music in a country in Africa, Mali. And they have these ancestral praise singers called griots, G-R-I-O-T. It's an ancestral, or it's a hereditary position. So if your dad was a griot, you might be a griot. If your dad wasn't a griot, you're not going to be a griot. But if your dad was a griot, you could be a griot. And one of these singers, and I forgot the exact number, but he was saying, I can sing they show up to parties, rich people, powerful people, kings, princes, invite them, and they would sing songs about their ancestors. They would sing songs about how great this current prince or king or ruler is, and they would sing the praises of their ancestors. And this one griot said, yeah, I can trace my lineage back and sing the praises of 74 of my famous ancestors. And I thought, 74 generations. 74 generations. That's like incomprehensible. Because I'm old and boring, I watch a show on public television called Finding Your Roots with Dr. Henry Louis Gates. He's an African-American researcher, and he does these genealogy shows. And with African Americans, it's always the same, that they discover that they have a large chunk of white blood. And the other thing is that their family trail often dead ends with slavery, and your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is on this slave owner's property list as male 37. So it occurred to me, African American, especially the griots, have this incredible sense of their history. This incredible, incredible sense of their history that has been stripped from them by slavery. They don't know what their ethnicity is because they were stolen from their homes and brought to this country. So they don't know what their homeland is. Genetic testing is getting better, but someplace in Africa, maybe West Africa, and the names of their ancestors, all of that's gone. All of that was stripped away by racist white people. So the Trail of Tears involved the relocation of the Seminoles, the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, basically everybody. And they got sent to Oklahoma. So from the swamps of Florida to Oklahoma. In California, the original plan was to relocate all the Native Americans to one reservation. And John Bidwell, one of the founders of Chico, said, hey, that's not a good idea. I know that to you they look all the same, but they're not. They speak different languages. They have different traditions. They don't necessarily get along with each other. So no, you got to give, each group needs their own reservation. But here you can see people from totally different regions of the country. The Cherokee would have been living up in the Appalachians, up in the mountains. And the Seminoles, like I said, living in the swamps. And they're all getting sent to a totally different part of the country. Oh, being forced to walk. They weren't shipped there. They were forced to walk. So ghetto is a European term. The first ghettos were for Jews in Europe, where they were forced to live in segregated neighborhoods. Yeah, it's kind of hard to have a definition. Is it just an ethnic region? In this country, it's typically African Americans, but is any black neighborhood a ghetto? Is there an economic status? Is there other criteria that we use? Yeah, back to is it a slum? Is it a ghetto? Are those two different things? I think the answer is yes. And why have we had ghettos? Because of racism. Discriminatory housing practices include redlining. And redlining, let me just go through these very quickly. Redlining is when you don't let qualified buyers, when you don't allow qualified buyers to get a loan to buy a house in a white neighborhood. So that's what redlining is. Steering is when you, as a real estate person, you guide, if there's listings in a white neighborhood and an African-American couple comes in, you say, well, we don't have anything. If you have properties available in African-American neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, you're going to steer them to the black neighborhoods and not even show them the white neighborhoods, even if they could afford it, even if they want to live there. And then blockbusting. Blockbusting is associated with white flight. And blockbusting occurred in the 1970s, 1960s, when African Americans continued to move out of the South. And when they would move into an area, the realtors would try to convince the white families that they really need to leave now because the property values are going to go down because those people have just moved into the neighborhood. In fact, later on, there's a slide that the Graves title, Graves was referring to it as "There Goes the Neighborhood," and I thought, oh yeah, that's blockbusting. That "There Goes the Neighborhood" was a phrase uttered by racist whites when an African-American family would ruin their neighborhood just by existing. So blockbusting is when, after the first African-American family moves in, realtors would go to other white families and say, hey, you'd better sell your house now while it's still worth something. Suburban ghettos. In California, across the United States, we had racist illegal deeds called covenants, conditions, restrictions, known as CC&Rs. This is, I think, from a place in Florida, but the language I checked, it was identical with deeds in Sacramento. And I put a link to a CAP public radio program from 2020. And one of the deals is this language is in your deed, right? No person except those of the white Caucasian, dude, the Caucasus, those are just a bunch of mountains. I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, the white Caucasian race shall occupy or reside upon any residential lot or plot except when employed in the household of a white Caucasian tenant or owner. So you could have black servants, but if you're black, you couldn't own a house. And geez, it's probably 15, 20 years ago, but I had a student who said, oh yeah, I bought a condo by Arden, and in the deed it had that language. And I said, can you bring it in? And she did, and that's exactly what it said. So I thought, this is relatively not that racist California, especially compared to the South. Relatively not racist California. And this would have been in the 60s and 70s when they were still writing racist deeds that said you can't live here unless you're white. So that would also be part of redlining. And redlining, it turns out there are actual maps. I'm speechless. Here's what I'm speechless about. The practice of redlining went on for 50 years in this country, but it was only, I think, in the 1980s that a researcher stumbled across these actual maps that codified. So these are maps by a home loan association, and I forgot the acronym of it. That is like HOLC, HORC, something like that. So an association of people that would give loans would rank neighborhoods. So as a lender, you could look and somebody wants to move into one of these red neighborhoods. The red are fourth grade. The blue is the best. I'm sorry, green is the best. Green, blue, yellow, and red is the worst. So you just wouldn't give loans in any of the red line sections. No, it's a bad neighborhood. By bad, I mean ethnic. By bad, I mean lower income. But Here we've got, zooming in on Sacramento, here we've got some of the downtown neighborhoods, Old Sac. Here we've got West Sac. Yeah, and this, I think it's either from area D4 or D2. This was the actual analysis in the report done by these people about which regions in Sacramento, and it was for the entire country, The old area is without deed restrictions, and while zoned general commercial and multifamily residential, the improvements are predominantly single family, 5 and 6 room frame dwellings of cheap to medium quality construction. Those dwellings are, as a rule, quite old, but for a district of this kind have been well maintained. Population is very mixed. Italians predominate, but with a sprinkling of Mexicans, Negroes, and Orientals. The subversive character of population constitutes the area's principal hazard. The area is accorded a medial red grade. The subversive character of the population. So the fact that they're Italian, Mexican, Negro, and Oriental is enough for these people to say it's a bad neighborhood. Ethnicities in Los Angeles, very, very, very similar. And I was trying to find, there's an African-American neighborhood, Baldwin Hills, where the African-American doctors and lawyers in Los Angeles had lived. I think it's down in here. It's by, I want to say it's east of the Crenshaw area. But African-Americans, Hispanics in East LA, white people on the coast. Whites are 40% of the population and inhabit the coastal edges. Blacks are mainly in South and South Central Los Angeles. Latinos in East Los Angeles, the green areas. Asians are scattered throughout. So again, it's that interesting thing of, well, how are Asians coded? Are they white? Are they not white? Are we prejudiced against them? Black ghettos, the most well-known of American ghettos, are reserved for African Americans. The oldest are in the Deep South, characterized by close integration, the early Southern. So this is the part where geographers have gone in and tried to identify specific patterns on the landscape and what caused those patterns. So after the Civil War, the classic Southern version evolves and is more segregated and features the across the tracks ghetto. So northern ghettos concentrated in the central business district in the inner city. Western ghettos typically trend along a transportation corridor like a freeway. So here's one version of these, the early Southern. So these would be the masters' houses. These would be slave quarters and then freed slave quarters. Classic Southern on the other side of the railroad tracks. It's interesting that that's the symbol for swamp. I'll bet that's a deliberate choice. Early Northern in the inner city, and then classic Northern, a compact inner city region around the central business district, the main business area of the city. So here we've got early Southern ghetto. Here we've got early Southern ghetto with people being mixed in together. Black people living on the same property, often in a small house along an alleyway. Before the Civil War, after the Civil War, they're not slaves anymore. So the black people are forced to live on the other side of the tracks. We've got early Northern with a central business district with black areas clustering, and then the later, the classic Northern, the inner city around the central business district being made up of African Americans. So depending on the layout of a city, like if we looked at a census map of a city, or if we looked just at a map of ethnicity of a city, you should be able to go, oh yeah, that's the classic Northern model, or oh, that's the classic Southern ghetto with the African American people literally on the other side of the train tracks. And then the new city, where the ethnic neighborhoods just sort of extend outward, but along a transportation corridor. So in this case, a highway. Blue areas may represent a Mexican-American neighborhood, African-American, African-American. The Great Migration. So we just looked at the Native American Trail of Tears. The Great Migration also called the Great Northward Migration or the Black Migration, was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural South into the urban Northeast, the Midwest, and the West that occurred between 1916 and 1970. I don't know why I copied the entire Wikipedia page, or at least the first part of the Wikipedia page. I must have had a good reason. Oh yeah, that's pretty good. The Great Migration was one of the largest and most rapid mass internal movements in history. In sheer numbers, it outranks the migration of any other ethnic group: Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles to the United States. For blacks, the migration meant leaving what had been their economic and social base in America and finding a new one. Oh yeah. By 1960, half of African Americans lived in urban areas. By 1970, 80% lived in cities. My wife is actually reading right now a book about this part of American history, about the Great Migration. And in Chicago, I might get the numbers wrong, but they'll be close enough. Chicago went before the Great Migration from about 1.8% African American to, I want to say 40%, 30 or 40% African American, going from a very small population to a very, very, very large population. So here we see the 1900 census with the darkest area is 60% African American. Hey, it's the Black Belt soils making another appearance. And you can see, yeah, African Americans are pretty much concentrated on the eastern seaboard and in the South. And the day-to-day violence and oppression is almost incomprehensible. Around 4,000 African Americans were hung publicly, beaten to death, publicly set on fire, publicly hung. I did not include in my research, I came across a couple articles talking about what a public spectacle it was. And the whole point of the lynching was to let the black population know you have no power. You are black and you are powerless. The fact that you're alive is because I don't want to kill you yet. Unbelievable. Absolutely. As somebody who grew up in California, the idea that the leaders of the town, the mayor, the chief of police, the fire department, all your friends would come out to watch the beating and killing and possible dismemberment before or after the death of black people as a political act of terrorism. And it occurred to me that legacy hasn't been addressed. I think I mentioned the response of white people was to form the Klan to terrorize black people. The response of white people was to put up statues honoring Confederate traitors. So this is killings per year. So like 1,500 killings, and then a second bubble with the second Klan. And in here we see, for example, the Tulsa massacre, with the murder and arson of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So very clear the reasons why you would want to leave the South. This is a museum and a memorial in the United States to the victims of racism, specifically lynching victims. So each of these brown things is a county, represents a county in the United States. And on each of those is a list of the names and the date that these people were lynched. I'm just going to back up, because when I first saw it, the scale took my breath away. That we would have to have a monument to African Americans that were brutalized and murdered for the crime of being black and being in the wrong place when a white person was angry. There's the remains of one of the pictures of the remains of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The National Guard got in on the murders, was actually dropping bombs from airplanes on African American businesses and houses and humans during this massacre. And I keep saying massacre. When I first heard of the Tulsa massacre, it was the Tulsa Race Riot. And I later found out, and I think I mentioned this before, the reason it was called a riot is because if it's a riot, the insurance companies don't have to pay out. It was not a riot. It was a massacre. It was a genocide. It was an act of genocide. White people decided to kill all the black people in this town. And then the white people called it a riot so that the insurance companies wouldn't have to pay for the rebuilding of the African Americans. The Green Book was a decent movie. The Green Book was featured in the movie The Green Book, starring Viggo and Mahershala Ali. And also it was seen in the HBO production Lovecraft Country. One of the plot devices was that they worked for a company like the Green Book it was a guide for the Negro Motorist Green Book. And in fact, in Lovecraft Country, they make reference to the fact that there were sundown towns in the United States where it was just illegal to be black and in the town after dark. They could kill you. That was the law. That was the law. And so if you're traveling as an African American, there's a very good chance that you would end up dead. And so this is a guide to which roads to take, which towns to avoid, what hotels, taverns, garages, nightclubs, restaurants, service stations, homes, roadhouses, barbershops, beauty parlors you could visit safely as an African American on your journeys across the United States. Man. The first Great Migration, we saw about 1.6 million people move from mostly rural areas in the South to northern industrial cities. And the second Great Migration, 1940, so during the war, post-war, which began after the Great Depression, brought at least 5 million people to the north and to the west. So here we can see if they're blue, they're decreases. If they're red, they're increases. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and to a greater extent, Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, New York, all these eastern, north, and west cities gained at the expense of African Americans leaving the South. Oh yeah, there's some good stuff. I think I just stole this right from the Census Department's page. Gary, Indiana in 1940 was about 18% black. In 1910, it was about 2.3%. Newark, New Jersey went from 10% black in 1940 to 54% black in 1970. And I don't think I really understood until recently how sudden and dramatic the increase was. And I thought, well, that kind of puts parts of the civil rights movement into a little bit more context. That we see, for example, right now, I think the greatest racism that we're seeing in this country is from the white people that live in these areas that have absolutely no experience with Hispanics or African American people. And, oh yeah, a couple of years ago, National Public Radio did a series of articles on the changing racial and cultural makeup of areas in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, with Hispanic construction workers, Hispanic meat packers changing the culture of a town from lily white to, well mixed, but not necessarily mixed, but a far greater proportion of Hispanics, of people from Mexico living in this town, and how the town was dealing with that very rapid cultural shift. So in the second migration, more than 5 million African Americans moved to the Northeast. We just saw that, New Jersey, New York, to the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, lots of manufacturing jobs. So remember, after World War II, we saw increased mechanization of agriculture, which means they didn't need as many people to work in the fields. So there were lots of people out of work. Racially, I cannot imagine living as an African American in the South. I cannot imagine living as an African American in the South then or today. But they migrated to the Midwest. They migrated to the West. Los Angeles, Oakland, Phoenix, Portland, and Seattle offered skilled jobs in the defense industry. Migrants were urban laborers who came from cities of discrimination in the South. Here's another. And I thought this was interesting, and I wonder to what extent this is true. I know that about 5 million people traveled out of out of the south up to the north on railroads, that railroads were incredibly important. In fact, just last night, my wife was saying that the Union Pacific cars would actually have to stop at like the Kentucky, Illinois, or the Kentucky-Ohio border. At the Kentucky-Ohio border, they would stop and take off the segregated cars and attach mixed cars. That they had segregated cars that were whites only and segregated blacks only cars. And as they crossed over into the free North, they would have to ditch the segregated cars or just take down the signs. So we've got Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. Oh, I like this. This was talking about different musical styles and how the musical styles in different parts of the country still have a geographic distribution because the people from this region mainly went to Los Angeles. The people from this region went to Kansas City and St. Louis. The people from Mississippi and Alabama ended up in Chicago. So if you like Mississippi blues, you should go listen to it in Chicago. If you like Georgia, South, North Carolina, Virginia blues, you should go to New York City. Neat. So this would be like the intersection of ethnicity and folk culture, because all these different styles of blues would be examples of folk culture. Why live in a ghetto? Well, I think the most obvious reason is you're forced to. In Italy, in Spain, in the Middle Ages, Jews were often forced to live in Paris. You know, the Fourth Arrondissement, the Marais, was the Jewish neighborhood. So why? Well, mainly they're forced to, but if they're forced to, they can provide support, defense, safety, preservation, possibly offensive capabilities if required. And this is kind of just a review. Hey, who are the Americans? Where'd we get them? Well, the answer is most of them from Germany. The 1940s, Germans, Chinese, and Irish came in large numbers. Italians, Poles, Eastern European Jews came in the latter half of the 19th century. Intra-American migration, so that's within America, migration brought blacks and hillbillies into the city from the south. Later still, Puerto Ricans, other Latin Americans, Koreans, Chinese, Vietnamese. So again, largest proportion of Americans, German. Oh, and then economic geography, looking at most common job held by immigrants. Ag workers, yeah, that's not surprising because they're mainly Hispanic, is my impression. Although in other places, janitors, cooks, I was going to say in Minneapolis, I think a large amount of hotel workers are Somali. College teachers, most common job held by immigrants. Where are they immigrating from? Most common country of origin of legal immigrants: China, India, Cuba, Mexico, Canada, Bhutan. Bhutan. I have no idea what's going on with this chain migration from Bhutan, but I am absolutely fascinated. Somalia, part of AOC's squad. I think Ilhan Omar is Somali. Most common country of origin of legal immigrants, and most common country of origin of legal immigrants other than Mexico. I like this. It's like when they look at the ethnicity and go, okay, we're gonna just remove the white people because they're dominant here, and let's see what's underneath. So if you say, fine, we're just gonna skip everybody that isn't Mexico, or we're gonna skip Mexico, Philippines, India, Myanmar, Bhutan, China, India. That's kind of fun. Iraq. Wow. Right on. Yeah, there goes the neighborhood. The ethnic neighborhoods grow and change. Eventually, they lose their character and acquire new one as new groups of people move in. In fact, this is an entire subdiscipline of human geography called sequent occupants. It's a field of historic geography where you look at how, for example, a town, the spatial changes in a town as a result of successive waves of migrants to that town. Yeah, every country has issue with immigrants. One of the main reasons that the US, Canada, and Mexico is different is our different ethnic mixes, also our different emphases on acculturation. in this country, I think there's always been a strong push to act more American. As I mentioned before, Canada, you could be Canadian and whatever else, that you could be bicultural. Cultural diffusion and ethnicity migration is what makes many ethnics. Chain migration, where you move someplace because you know people from there. Channelized migration is when there's a much easier path, and that's what people follow. And the return migration is like the opposite of chain migration, with people going back and forth between their home country, their new country. So with chain migration, we've got source regions from South Texas, Coahuila, San Luis Potosí, and then Southern California from Baja California Norte, Sinaloa, Nayarit, Jalisco, Michoacan. So in the United States then, based on the idea of chain migration, there should be distinctive areas with higher concentrations of people from Baja California Norte, from Sinaloa, from Jalisco, from Colima, from Michoacan. So yeah, environmental racism. Environmental racism is just like what it sounds like. It's racism. It's an environmental. So here we've got, this is the HOLC, is that acronym that I was talking about before from the redlining, the group of people that decide if cities are good and if you should give loans to people in that neighborhood, the ABCD grading scheme. So here we've got in Memphis, Tennessee, the red areas got Ds, the yellow areas are Cs, and the little purple dots are toxic areas, and the green diamonds are toxic release sites. So it looks to me anyway that there's a pattern of, I was gonna say there's one in a blue neighborhood, but it looks like everything else is in the red and yellow neighborhoods. And then if we look on this map of minorities, this one's moderate minority, but it looks like the toxic release, the actual release sites are all minority neighborhoods. Yeah, I don't see any of them in the low minority best neighborhood. Yeah. So this would be brownfields, which are toxic sites, and then the toxic release sites are actually like factories that have released toxics into the air or water. So people of color are exposed to 46% more nitrogen dioxide. They probably live closer to freeways, for example. That's really weird. White people have the lowest, black, Hispanic higher, and Asian is the highest. Huh. Looking at lead levels in blood, African-American children have the highest levels of lead in their blood. Lead causes brain damage. Lead is either left over from lead paint in older buildings, because it was legal to put lead in paint because it made it easier to use the paint. And also in gasoline, lead was an important component in gasoline until relatively recently, even though the gasoline industry knew it was killing people. They just didn't care because they were making money. In fact, there's a famous story about the public relations guy literally went around the country drinking this liquid lead called tetraethyl lead that was the gasoline additive. And he went around the country and would like drink a glass of it to prove that it was safe. And he knew it was killing him. I cannot imagine selling your soul to the point that you would go around the country and deliberately drink lead for money to prove to people that your industry was safe, that the industry that you knew was killing people was pretending to be safe. Okay, same deal. This is Los Angeles. The yellow regions have the least people of color, and the red areas have the most people of color. And it looks very clearly, if I was going to do this map, I would have put the freeways. Not sure what's going on there, but that's sure as heck is one linear pattern. I think that's 5. I think that's 101. And you can see that there's like on the fringes, on the intersection, the ecotone, if you will, the region, the border between the yellow low minority and the high minority, that a lot of the toxic release facilities are in the areas with more people of color. A summary sheet race is the race. Well, that would be a combination of ethnicity and socioeconomic status. But yeah, 58%, 95% of their claims against polluters were denied. Yeah, if it's a family of low-income immigrants versus Dow Chemical, I'm not surprised they lost. And then I found a bunch more examples of environmental racism. This is the town of St. James. In Louisiana, there's New Orleans, Baton Rouge. So we've got, what are we looking at? The towns of Covenant and Uncle Sam and the town of St. James. So here's St. James in the yellow, Covenant and Uncle Sam in this purple. That St. James is 91% black. Medium household income is $30,000 compared to Louisiana's $47,000. Covenant and Uncle Sam also black, but with a higher median income and still polluting industries. Here we've got Houston, Texas, and Harrisburg and Manchester. Manchester, toponyms. Man, I love toponyms. Manchester is a city in England, so we can at least guess about the ethnicity of the people that named the city. So Manchester, their income is about half what Texas's average income is, 96% Hispanic, and that's where we're going to put the petrochemical manufacturing, inorganic chemical manufacturing, and refining industry. We're going to put that where the poor people live. And the Decolonial Atlas is a group of researchers and geographers. This is a mapping of people killed by police in Atlanta. So the bluer it is, the whiter it is. The tanner it is, the less white it is. So the blue dots are people that were killed by police that were white, and the green dots are people that were killed by police that were black. I would like to take this opportunity to remind you again that African Americans are a minority. So the fact that so many more of them were shot to death by police compared with white people indicates that something is going on racially. Baton Rouge, same deal, heavily minority, and that's where the police kill black people at a much higher rate than they're killing white people here. Chicago, I'll bet you didn't think that we'd be spending as much time looking at Chicago as we are. So these are all those minority districts that we were looking at before. It looks like mainly killing black people and Hispanics, 2 Asians, and then a smattering of white people. Los Angeles, Hispanics, blacks versus whites, and the pattern, boy, yeah, that certainly seems like there's a clear pattern of who's getting killed where, that the ethnicities are getting killed in their neighborhoods, and the white people are largely not being murdered by the police in their neighborhoods. Philadelphia, same deal. African Americans being murdered, white people largely not. And it would be, yeah, I keep saying it. It would be good to see. It would be good to see like some socioeconomic data. So we know the ethnic makeup of these neighborhoods, but I would like to see, like, you know, I don't think that this would have been a higher income neighborhood over here on the beach. Yeah, that would be. But like where's Beverly Hills? What's the murder? How many people are being killed by police in Beverly Hills? How many people are being killed by police in South Central LA or in East LA, where I would expect to find lower income levels? Los Angeles, Philadelphia. Ethnic ecology grades talks a bit about the people that show up someplace. Sometimes they're culturally pre-adapted, like they already know what to do. Scandinavians in the upper Midwest, Germans in the Midwest. Both of those, I think, are examples. You know, I keep talking about the Lutheran Scandinavian farmers of the far north plains states in the United States, and the Germans all across the Midwest are all, well, the climate, yeah, it's similar to home, so we can grow the same food the same way. That's cool. Some places maladaption, like the Puritans when they showed up in New England had no idea what to do. They should have all starved to death. But yeah, Native Americans took pity on them and showed them how to farm in their new country. Yeah, basically nothing that the Puritans did at home worked in the new land. So they were the exact opposite of the Scandinavians. Scandinavians showed up and the climate was the same and they could grow the same food, grow it the same way, eat the same stuff. The Puritans, or the early colonists, also the Puritans in New England, showed up and they tried to grow wheat and it just was a disaster. They tried to raise cattle. That was a disaster. Nothing worked. And the doctrine of the first effective settlement is the idea that the culture of the first settling group will set the stage, and that the culture of the first group is going to be more important in the long run at maintaining, at setting the default culture and maintaining the default culture than the thousands of later immigrants from different places. Oh, yeah, just some random fun things. Ethnicity and business activity. Half of motels are run by South Asian Americans. Korean Americans own almost all the African American hair care product stores. And the African Americans the motels, turns out was one guy. That this was an example of, it's not exactly chain migration. It might be an example of stimulus diffusion, where the idea of something spreads. And in this case, it would be the idea in the South Asian community of running a motel. And that now half of motels in the US are run by South Asian Americans, and it all traces back to this one guy. Just like Korean Americans had some trade advantages over importing African American hair care products. And so they got established and are still established in the African American hair care product game. Yeah, I'll let you look through this. It's just showing by ethnicity: Asian, white, Hispanic, Black, and occupations of management and sales, natural resources, construction, transportation, and the service industry. So like the group that's dominant in the service industry would be Hispanic and Latino women. The group that would be dominant in management and professional would be Asian men. The dominant sales group would be white women. Interesting. Oh, golly, that's it for the chapter on ethnic geography. I hope you enjoy it, and I wish you good luck.